and I'll try this time to go through it without any kind of emotions, but it tells. It's for me a telling example of the difference between looking at a statistic and looking at a human being. In the central bank, we reeled off these numbers about the number of Nigerians living on less than $1 a day. And I tell people I never knew what it meant to live on less than $1 a day until I became the Emir. And one instance I give is what I still consider perhaps the saddest day in my life, because usually when I sit in court, people come, some have problems with their husbands, some have problems with their wives, some have issues with their neighbors, some have land issues, some need help with drugs. And while sitting there, I heard this loud scream. And I sent someone to find out what it was. And there was this woman who had walked across from the hospital, across from the palace, among a group of women with their children. And while waiting for her turn to see the Emir, her baby had died. And the baby died because she did not have 3,000 naira for drugs. That's less than $10. And there were 8 women in line on that day, and all of them needed like 20,000 naira. So, this is a country where people, or part of the country, where a woman would lose her baby because she cannot buy drugs of $5 or $10. That is what it means to live on less than $1 a day. Now, it radically changes and transforms one's view of life, of development, of poverty. And you begin to look at how we have defined our development in terms of trying to look very much like what you call the developed world. So you go to Abuja and you've got all these beautiful bridges, and even in Cairo, beautiful bridges, overhead bridges, beautiful roads, street lights, skyscrapers, and we see that as development. When in fact, the vast majority of the people who are walking on those streets are hungry and they're sick and they've got nothing to do. And for a fraction of those resources, you could change the lives of people. Take Nigeria. In 1960, the amount of land available to a rural dweller on the average was 2 hectares. Today it is 0.9. And in the next decade or two, it will be down to 0.5. It's a combination of desertification, desalination, erosion, and other environmental issues, but it's also about demographic explosion. And that has led to all sorts of conflicts. We hear every day about Fulani herdsmen and their conflicts with grazers, and people ethnicize or give religious colorations to what, by the way, is a problem that's as old as the Old Testament itself. You give them grazing land, you encroach on the land, you're going to have these problems. We have Boko Haram, we have ethnic conflicts, and we're not joining the dots. We're not beginning to make a connection between a failure of social policy and the social unrest and the economic problems that we face as a country. So I come from a part of the country which is a part of the Sahel, which I suppose 500 years ago, 600 years ago was the richest part of sub-Saharan Africa, eclipsed later with the discovery of the steamship and colonialism and the coastal cities. So cities like Kano and Katsina and Timbuktu and Gao got eclipsed by Lagos and Accra and Abidjan and so on. But with social structures and family structures and social organizations that were formed for wealthy societies, which have not yet understood that the world has changed. Okay, so it's very easy in Kano to see a man who has no employment of any sort and who earns nothing marry 3 women and have 18, 19 children, and he's very happy to have them roam the streets as what you call al-majri. And it's also very easy to see public officers discussing how they're going to find the money, how they're going to build the schools, how they're going to take care of Al-Majire, without anybody ever asking if the father who gave birth to this child had certain responsibilities in the first place, and if he should be held responsible for the child that he brought. While the rest of the Muslim world has introduced reforms to family law, looked at such things as the age at which girls marry, the issues like child spacing, regulated polygamy, make sure that you're able to maintain a family before you have it, child rights. These are issues that are not part of the conversation, or they've just started being part of the conversation in a very difficult manner in the North, partly because of a culture that has been built in which the interpretations of Islam and certain historical social structures have become so conflated that it's very easy to get emotional rather than have a rational and proper intellectual conversation. So, how did we get here? How did we get to a situation where today the very large percentage of girl children in the North never complete school? If you take the northeast and northwest of Nigeria, maybe about 10% or less of the adolescent girls read and write. The northeast has maternal mortality rates 5 times the global average. In a state like Zamfara and a state like Yobe, 90% of the population is living in poverty. Where you have in Kano State alone 3 million children who are out of school, and in the north maybe 15, 16 million statistically out of school. So Nigeria, after India, has the highest number of out of school children in the world. How did we get to a situation where one country has become effectively 2 countries, where you would, as I said in a recent speech, which didn't go down well with people, if the North itself were a country on its own, it probably would be one of the poorest countries in the world, because we're not looking below the headline numbers. Now, there are a number of issues that we need to look at. Some of them, I think, have not been seriously considered in academic discourse, and I'm hoping that institutes like yours would look at the implications of some of the events of our history. So if we go back to colonial educational policy and the works, of course, of people like Ibn Darana, who've seriously studied education, especially in northern Nigeria, and the policy of the British as far as education was concerned. Misdefining and misunderstanding our priorities. And we have to be very honest with ourselves. I'm an economist, and I always talk economics, and we look at the numbers, and we look at poverty. If you look at all the poverty indices in the world today, you find that in southwest Nigeria, the incidence of poverty is 20%. In the northwest, it is 80%. The northeast, it's 80%. Why is it that the poorest parts of this country are the Muslim parts? Why is it that in a state that started Sharia in 1999, and we just heard the opening verses today, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. This is the very first verse revealed in the Quran. How come that the state that started Sharia is not the one that is the most educated state? In fact, how come that in that state in 2017, only 24 children got 5 credits in secondary school? How do we define Sharia? How do we define Islam? Illiteracy? malnutrition, children on the streets? We have to ask ourselves. And we can't ask those questions until we begin to understand through usul that you have to live in this world well in order to serve Allah for the hereafter. For Islam to prosper, we need educated Muslims. We need Muslims that are not begging. We need Muslims who are standing on their feet. Believe me, if poverty continues in the north, Islam will disappear from the north. The Prophet said, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-kufri wal-faqri. Allah, I seek refuge with you from disbelief and poverty. And he said, Kad al-faqru an yakuna kufran. Poverty can lead to disbelief. These children that we see as al-majiris and we laugh at them and we treat them as victims, somebody will just come and pick them up, put them in a school, give them medical care, and convert them to another religion. And they will do that by the hundreds and the thousands. So, what we see on the street is a product of bad economic policies and wrong priorities. These children are not criminals, they are victims. What part of Islamic law, what verse in the Quran, what hadith of the Prophet allows a father to give birth to a child and leave the child to go and fend for?
The truth is, nobody who is a leader in northern Nigeria today can afford to be happy. You can't be happy with 87% of the poverty in Nigeria being in the north. You can't be happy with millions of northern children out of school. You can't be happy with 9 states in the north contributing almost 50% of the entire malnutrition burden in the country. You can't be happy with the drug problem. You can't be happy with the Boko Haram problem. You can't be happy with political thuggery. You can't be happy with all the issues, the Al-Majiri problem that we have. So when we wish Nasir a happy birthday, we do not want him to be happy as a leader, because you are happy when you think you have reached a state of delivering and taking your people to where you want them to be. Now, because of the condition of northern Nigeria, it is almost cliche now to say, if you are seen as normal, if you're a governor in the north or a leader in the north, and if you are seen as normal in the sense that you continue to do what your predecessors have been doing the same thing which has been normalized, then there's something wrong with you. You are part of the problem. The real change in the north will come from the mavericks, those who are considered mad people, because you look around and you have to say, if this is the way we have been doing things, and this is where we have ended up, maybe we need to do things differently. If we have populated the government with middle-aged men, maybe we need to try younger people. Maybe we need to try women. If we have spent our time and our money on physical infrastructure, maybe we need to invest more in the education of our children. Maybe we need to invest more in nutrition. Maybe we need to invest more in primary health care. And the truth is, if you look at what Nasser is doing in Kaduna with 40% of his budget in education, That is the only thing that is going to save the North. And I know that when we say these things, they don't go down well. We've been saying this for 20, 30 years. If the North does not change, the North will destroy itself. The country is moving on. Quota system that everybody talks about must have a sunset clause. The reason people like Nasser stand up and they're nationalists is that you don't have any sense of inadequacy. You don't need to ride on being from Kaduna State or being from the North or being a Muslim to get a job. You go with your credentials, you go with your competence, you can compete with any Nigerian from anywhere. We need to get our northern youth to a point where they don't need to rely on being from a part of the country to get a job. And believe me, if we don't listen, there will be a day when there will be a constitutional amendment that addresses this issue of quota system and federal character. The rest of the country cannot be investing, educating its children, producing graduates, and then they watch us, they can't get jobs because they come from the wrong state, when we have not invested in the education of our own children. So as we celebrate Nasser at 60, we need to celebrate him as a public officer who is addressing the core problems of his constituency. It is education, it's girl-child education, it's women's rights, it's child begging, parental irresponsibility, demographic growth. It's managing a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society and bringing them into one community where they're all citizens. And he's done a lot that we can learn from.
Change. And there's a very large number of Muslims that, frankly, they do feel uncomfortable with this, but they don't have enough understanding of the law, so they think it's actually Islam. And so they're very happy to hear that this is actually not religion, but culture. So I would say that this change is not going to be as difficult as you think, but we've got to deal with it. But the other side to your argument, which is true, in a village, wait until your daughter is 16 and you don't have a school in the village, what then happens? Which is why, again, we've got to think out of the box a number of things. One of the things I've talked about is the use of mosques for schools. And please, if there's any Nigerian journalist here, tell me so that I know how to say this 5 times so that I don't get the kind of misrepresentations I had the last time. Now, if you look at a geospatial map of Kano, you'd probably see 20 mosques before you see a school. But if you go to Muslim history, mosques were never just buildings for prayers. I mean, the mosques were schools, mosques were places where you had political meetings, mosques were places where rulers were crowned or appointed and so on. If you go to Fars in Morocco, the university is in the mosque. The great University of Al-Azhar, they're all in the mosque. No, not in every part of northern Nigeria, but in the traditional mosques, yes. But now you've got a number of mosques being built with sections for women. I think most of the modern structures do have places for women, but that's still just for prayer. But the point I'm making is if you have a mosque, then you have a school. There's no reason why you can't bring teachers and students to learn in the mosque. It's just what happens all over the Muslim world. Why is it not happening in our part of the Muslim world? Why do you need to have money to build a primary school or exclude a child from primary education because his parents cannot afford transportation to primary school when there's a mosque next door? Now, when I said that, I think the headlines were that I said all mosques should be converted to schools, okay? And I somehow, I don't know how they got to that interpretation, but everything got buried in that. But that's the point. So you've got to think out of the box in terms of converting basically, like I said, so you've got this civilization that's produced all these mosques. These mosques can be an asset. You can use the mosque as a primary school. You can use the mosque as a secondary school. You can use the mosque as a hospital if you want, and then clean it up for prayer. So you don't need to start construction. Bring the teachers, bring internet connectivity, bring some solar power, bring some tablets, and you'll be amazed what kind of education you can take to a rural area, okay, for the cost of brick and mortar for a school. So that's it. So you've got to deal with education, deal with poverty, build the schools, and then you need all these foundations and the private sector support. People need to give scholarships. People need to support children. This is how the Turks did. They had foundations. I mean, Suleiman the Magnificent had these great foundations attached to mosques that sponsored poor children and gave them education. And we need to do more of that.